Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 11th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you're here. I could have stopped at 10, but sometimes you need that little extra push over the cliff. So this one goes to 11. Last time, we followed the events of the death of first Cyrus, then Cambyses. We got to know the very strange tale of the fate of the last son of Cyrus, Bardia, and the rise of Darius, a member of the junior branch of the Achaemenid family. Probably. Finally, I closed with a humble plea for all you wonderful people to help me spread the word about this podcast. Help, please, and thank you. With the dramatic events to kick things off, the reign of Darius was off to a violent and suspicious start. Not only had he careened about the empire, putting out very real revolts, but he also purged a former ally and his family on the suspicion of having plotted a coup. Violent though it may have been, the energy of the new King of Kings was impressive, but these early years left the empire a chaotic, disorganized mess. You may recall from the Cyrus episode that one of the prime reasons for the collapse of the Neo-Babylonians was that their empire, won from the relentless conquest and organizational capabilities of Nebuchadnezzar the Great, suffered from the string of incompetent, disinterested, or downright illegitimate rulers that inherited the kingdom. The successors to the great king drove the empire into the ground almost immediately, and it was only when Cyrus put the Neo-Babylonians out of their misery that the place regained some semblance of an order. There is no questioning that Cyrus, like Nebuchadnezzar, was a gifted administrator. But like Nebuchadnezzar, would Cyrus also be cursed to sit at top of the high water mark of a rapidly constructed empire, fated to collapse within memory of his lifetime? Or would the Persians be fortunate to have one great king follow another, or one who could build on the administrative apparatus and consolidate territorial conquest into a cohesive polity? The simple yet clever ruse that won Darius the throne in the first place might have been a bit of a shortcut, but it tipped us off to the idea that his mind was always on overdrive, thinking, planning, scheming. Thus, fortunately for Cyrus and the Persians, Darius's true genius was in administration. Keep in mind, the Persian Empire had been cobbled together piecemeal from Cyrus's many epic conquests. Cyrus founded the empire by toppling and absorbing several mighty kingdoms, including the Medes, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Lydians. He also incorporated several lesser ones west into Europe and east into Asia. Cambyses conquered Egypt and radiated Persian power out into Africa. The empire was a patchwork, not yet coalesced into a true state. Cyrus had gotten off to a good start on this front, having appointed some talented nobles, and even former adversaries, to key satrapies. He had infused his empire's administration with the values of justice and truth-telling, but these efforts were nascent, cut short by his violent death on campaign. Besides, in the ancient world, no message could move faster than the speed of a horse, so any decree from the King of Kings took a long time to make it from one side of the empire to the other. Reform, promulgation of imperial communication, and implementation of laws, all were slow in arriving at their intended destinations and in taking hold. It took a lot of time to consolidate hard-won military conquest into a smooth-running administrative apparatus. Once Darius had quieted all the rebellions and subdued all the challenges to his throne, both real and suspected, he next set his fervent mind to the task of organization. If this grand empire was going to last, he needed to tidy up the place a bit. Darius rolled up his sleeves and got to work overhauling the physical and administrative infrastructure of the empire. One key decision he made early in his rule was to establish a new focal point for the Achaemenid Empire, a spiritual heartbeat for this massive undertaking. Located in a remote mountainous region of Persia, Persepolis was not a city in the traditional sense. Rather, it was a grand ceremonial center, complete with palaces, civic administration complexes, grand gates and entryways, carvings, inscriptions, statuary, you name it. The vision for the usage of, and the site for the city, were complements of Cyrus, but it took Darius to bring it to life, and it was Darius that poured in the cash and the resources that saw Persepolis rise. Like our old friends Akhenaten and Ramses, who likewise willed entirely new and massive cities into existence, Darius wanted nothing but the best. He put up massive outlays to ensure his capital would be the grandest city in the world. In order to realize this vision, Darius cut his emissaries loose. Armed with blank checkbooks, or more precisely, laden with gold, they fanned out across the civilized world to buy and arrange for the import of luxury building materials and to hire the world's best craftsmen, artisans, and architects. Darius, as his rule would come to demonstrate time and again, was fundamentally cosmopolitan in his outlook. He understood that the Persians weren't the only people out there, and that knowledge and skill existed in far-off corners of the world. He respected other cultures, he respected their artistry and their knowledge, and he sent his people out to find that knowledge, to find that skill, and to pay whatever it took to bring the very best back to Persia and to beautify his new civic project. By bringing in artisans and architects from across the Persian Empire, and even further afield, Persepolis combined the knowledge and wisdom of some of the world's most skilled builders. A new ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, one that infused long-standing tradition with new and exciting knowledge from other peoples and cultures, began to take shape. Persepolis was a home befitting the King of Kings, and was a place for Darius to receive vassals and ambassadors and to perform sacred rituals that kept the cosmos in alignment. Persepolis was built on a grand scale to awe visiting dignitaries and reinforce the exalted status of the most powerful ruler in the world. To amplify the effect, the city was built on top of a huge platform. Imagine huge, long, hulking city walls, but then imagine the entire enclosure filled in, and only on top of this did the buildings begin to arise. By itself, Persepolis was not the largest city in the Persian Empire, but every element, every building, every statue, every monumental stairway or gateway, everything was built with one thing in mind: to overawe visitors with the power and the glory of the King of Kings. In a typical city, much of the urban center is given over to housing people at every level of society, and to mundane things like docks or markets or workshops for producing clothes, pottery, leather, etc. Take all these things out and leave only the grand, monumental civic structures, and you get Persepolis. It was likely the most richly adorned city in the world, and it was only put to use on special occasions just a few times a year. Otherwise, it was mostly empty. The city was a grand showpiece of unsurpassed beauty and majesty, and only occupied for a few days here and there. How Persepolis fell into ruin is a tragedy discussed as we meet our next great in this series. Even in its ruined state, it is astonishing in scope and grandeur. Persepolis is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a place I personally want to visit with every fiber of my being. But even this grand capital had its limits, including its remote location away from the day-to-day activity that drove the empire. Undoubtedly, the ceremonial function of Persepolis was unlike anything that had been built before, but one thing Persepolis was not designed to do was be an administrative hub of a huge empire. Further removed from vital trade routes and communication routes, the city was better suited as a showpiece than a bureaucratic nerve center. As such, Darius shifted the administrative capital of the empire to the old Elamite city of Susa. You may remember that Cyrus had incorporated the ancient Elamites into the Achaemenid Empire as part of his territorial expansion and as a prologue to his conquest of Babylon. Susa was one of the most ancient cities in the world, and it was well poised to move information and imperial decrees east, west, north, south, so that Darius' reach could radiate out in all directions. The large-scale building project at Persepolis was a monumental achievement, but Darius also took great pains to embellish and beautify many of the grand cities of the empire. Susa, Babylon, Ecbatana. He breathed new life into all of them, all incorporating the dramatic new architectural and artistic innovations that resulted from the cultural exchange that he facilitated by importing not just exotic materials, but the finest artists and architects in the world. What was emerging in his building program was something new and distinct, an aesthetic for his time, and one which echoes to this day. Darius deserves immense credit for the beautification of the empire and its ancient urban centers. He revolutionized art and architecture. Keep in mind, Darius was one generation removed from the collapse of the Neo-Babylonians and the successor of the conquering Cyrus. The generation that had preceded him had engaged in significant conquest and warfare, which had drained the resources of all the various kingdoms and their urban centers. Quite a lot of cities and buildings had fallen into disrepair, worn down by neglect or battles, or, such is the case of Babylon itself, just plain administrative incompetence. Darius shored up the foundations, literally, of his empire. To do so, he brought together not just artisans and architects, but the specialty materials from each of the regions of his dominions, such as cedar wood from Lebanon, ivory from Nubia, gold from Bactria, and so on. In addition to honing a new aesthetic, Darius' grand projects represented the empire in miniature. Every major city found a full expression of the expansive Persian world. every project reminded all of the scope and the grandeur of Darius's awesome and unsurpassed power. Darius embodied the cities embodied him. He also used building to project his brilliance outside of the core of his empire. He didn't just embellish Persian or Mesopotamian cities. He ordered restoration of Egyptian temples. He encouraged the rebuilding of the Great Temple in Jerusalem, which had been destroyed a century earlier by Nebuchadnezzar. He contributed significant resources to help bring these projects to life. Honoring the legacy of Cyrus, his patronage of these religious centers furthered the imperial policy of freedom of worship. He demonstrated great respect for systems of thought and belief that were different from his own, and he never seems to have undertaken any effort to systematize cultural norms or values uniformly throughout his empire. Rather, and like his predecessors, he embraced the multiculturalism of the empire. The Persian Empire was huge. I know I've said it before, but it stretched from the doorstops of India all the way across and down to Egypt. It covered deserts, mountains, valleys, seas, lakes, rivers, and oceans. Travel from one side of the empire to the other was nearly impossible, and it could take years. This was more than an inconvenience. It was both an economic hindrance and a militaristic nightmare. From a military point of view, if the king needed to move from one side of his empire to the other to stamp out one of those pesky rebellions or simply inspect his imperial holdings, getting from here to there could be a serious challenge. A slow response from the King of Kings meant that any subjects who had ideas could have a long lead time in kicking off a revolt. Considering commerce, one of the benefits of such a huge empire was that the specialty goods of one region were often considered luxury items of high value in another. Facilitating trade within the empire, as well as those peoples on its borders, could be massively profitable. But big distances and poor infrastructure was a big drag on commerce. What good was linking up East and West into a single polity if you couldn't effectively trade within it? Darius thought in terms of solutions at scale. Things moved too slowly, operated too inefficiently. He needed speed, and he needed it right away. With his characteristic combination of impatience and vision, Darius ordered the construction of roads. Lots and lots of roads. One road, called the Royal Road, stretched all the way from the administrative capital of Susa all the way to western Anatolia and the Old Kingdom of Lydia, a distance of nearly 1,700 miles. Along the way, it linked up many of the important cities of the western half of the empire, including Babylon. The Royal Road also served as a gateway to the eastern half of the empire. The Romans always get credit for their famous road network, and their most famous road, the Appian Way. But the Appian Way is still more than 2 centuries in the future and would stretch a mere 130 miles or so. The Royal Road was 13 times longer. It was a stunning feat of engineering. Mind you, this was one part of a complex system of roads that linked key cities and provinces all across the empire. This dramatically improved the infrastructure, reduced travel times, and sped up the movements of goods, services, imperial decrees, and troops. But a juicy trade caravan working its way down any such road might make a tempting target for people with other agendas. Travel in the ancient world could be dangerous. Robbers and bandits always loved pouncing on unsuspected travelers for a quick score. Darius took great care to ensure the safety of travelers. He sanctioned law enforcement organizations tasked with policing and regularly patrolling the roads. The punishments for those caught stealing from those conducting commerce, or for those hindering official business on the imperial road network, were harsh. But the roads offered more than smooth commerce to the king. He put this extensive network to use to ensure that his own rule would be long, lasting, and secure. Darius established an agency called Espesgan and Kavashgan, Watchers and Listeners. This was a state intelligence agency tasked with gathering up intel from all over the empire and funneling it back to one of the King of Kings' chief advisors, who, in turn, processed the information and briefed Darius on it. In this way, the administrative genius of Darius conceptualized the idea of a national security advisor more than 2,500 years ago. The spies in this agency, his eyes and ears, his watchers and listeners, got on his road system and fanned out across the empire. Officially tasked with supervising the goings-on across the empire, these spies had the official title of the King's Eye. Their intel was gathered up, processed, and presented to Darius. Either directly or through proxy, he was everywhere, always watching, always ready to judge if people were living in the truth or the lie. Woe to those living in the lie. The breadth and depth of the Persian road structure was, and still is, astonishing. Before Darius, there was nothing like the Persian road system. With it, we get tantalizingly close to what we think of today as the Silk Road. The world is getting smaller with each episode. The amount of roads that he built or linked into the system is in the thousands and thousands of miles. His infrastructure project was on a scale and built with a speed that is hard to fathom. Think of how many administrators were needed to oversee these projects, engineers to survey and to build the roads, materials that had to be sourced and transported, labor that had to be procured, all of this happening all at once, all over the empire across thousands and thousands of miles. It might be easy to think that any such rush job would lead to shoddy construction, but the quality of the Persian road network marked it out as a marvel for its age. Having the road system was good. Putting it to full effect was better. To amplify the effect of his system, Darius went a step beyond. The stables would keep fresh horses, ready to go at a moment's notice. Let's say that Darius had an urgent decree he needed to cross his expansive empire with lightning speed, or an order he needed in the hands of his satrapy yesterday. Typically, not only could a message only travel as far as a horse could carry it, but also a horse could only ride for so long before becoming overcome with exhaustion. The rider would need to wait for his horse to rest, eat, and recover from being ridden at a frenetic pace. Darius's infrastructure system anticipated this challenge, and his road networks included stables, where a rider could pull up, exchange a tired horse for a new one, and take off again as fast as he could ride, leaving behind his old horse to recover, rest up, and be ready for the next messenger. Of course, a rider could only go so far before they themselves would be pushed to the brink of exhaustion. Solving this, Darius's networks also included way stations and inns along the length of the royal road to provide rest for weary riders and even fresh riders who could take over a message, keep it moving without delay. Solving this, Darius's networks also included way stations and inns along the length of the royal road to provide rest for weary riders and even fresh riders who could take a message and keep it moving without delay. Thanks to this elaborate system, information moved faster than at any time in history. To take full advantage of this infrastructure and to bring it all to life, to make it all work, Darius implemented an imperial postal service tasked with moving messages from one end of the empire to the other. Given the efficiency of the system, a message could make it the entire length of the royal road in as few as 7 days, roughly the distance from New York City to Denver, Colorado. In fact, it was this system that was conceived of and built by Darius that would serve as the inspiration for the United States postal system a few thousand years later. The Greek historian Herodotus, who was rarely forthcoming with compliments where the Persians were concerned, marveled over this system. Well, let's give him a quote. "There is nothing that travels faster and yet is mortal than these couriers. The Persians invented this system, which works as follows. It is said that there are as many horses and men posted at intervals as there are days required for the entire journey, so that 1 horse and 1 man are assigned to each day. And neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor dark of night keeps them from completing their appointed course as swiftly as possible." Now, if you're listening from the U.S., you might have recognized the U.S. Postal Service credo, which goes, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." The Persian messaging system was further enhanced by standardizing the language used in official communications, and Aramaic became the lingua franca of the empire, despite this not being the native language of the King of Kings. Darius understood that this language had greater reach and more common understanding than his own native tongue. He forwent the need to promote his own language and opted instead for pragmatism. The messages even had a standardized format. Nothing was left to regional variants, not even critical messages about the castle. All these messages, whipping around the empire at blazing speed, the royal road was, in a very literal sense, the world's first information superhighway. The road was only for state-sanctioned government use, official business only, please. This gave Darius and his satraps a monopoly on speed of information, of troop movements, personal transport, etc. And all the while, his security forces and spies kept the peace and kept watch. Beyond the infrastructure, Darius also took a holistic approach to the administration of his sprawling empire. He reorganized the territories into 20 satrapies and made sure to appoint good, trustworthy, and ethical people to the posts. Any governor or judge abusing their power faced the stern wrath of Darius. Each administrator was expected to operate in keeping with the truth of Lord Wisdom, Ahura Mazda. Corruption, abuse of power, idleness, incompetence, none were tolerated. Administrators found to violate their responsibilities for personal gain could be condemned to execution. Officials in Darius's government were held to a high standard of truth, of justice, fair-minded application of the law to all citizens. And the law was a topic of great importance to Darius. He was a prolific lawgiver, issuing new legal codes on a wide range of topics, and with everyone citing the law as an act of pious devotion to Ahura Mazda. Truth and justice, the dual components of Lord Wisdom's benevolence over mankind, found their expression in Darius's legal code, and in his administration of it. Many of his laws were novel, designed to reflect the challenges and realities of the present, but some were based on older traditions. In fact, some of the laws promulgated by Darius were copied verbatim from the Code of Hammurabi, breathing new life into the legal code set forth by the renowned lawgiver some 12 centuries earlier. Darius had a keen sense of history, and while he certainly never shied away from bragging about his own greatness, he also acknowledged and celebrated the legacies of illustrious forebears. Darius understood that aligning himself with the great people that came before him allowed him to accumulate their legacies into his own. He needed both long-dead antecedents and still-breathing subordinates to make it all work. Provided they governed in accordance with Darius's standards, the satraps were given a large measure of autonomy to administer their regions as semi-independent kingdoms. Judges were granted the ability to issue rulings based on their own judgment and their application of the law. The amount of tax or tribute each satrapy was supposed to produce and deliver was established in advance. Imperial revenues were forecasted and budgeted, and a cadre of professional bureaucrats reconciled the numbers to make sure no governor was skimming off the top. But just to make sure, the king's eyes and ears were out there, watching, listening, reporting back to Darius. In my hotels, there is always someone watching. Darius also put his considerable administrative gifts to commerce. Inspired by the Lydians, the incorporation of whose territory into the Persian Empire we discussed in the Cyrus episode, he standardized the currency with gold and silver coins to create different denominations. These coins, called Darics after the king himself, had standardized value all the way across the approximately 3,000-mile wide breadth of the empire. It was like the euro, only on a much wider scale. This standardization enabled easy transactions between the locals and international traders. Universal value of currency eliminates friction in markets, and commerce boomed. The economy thrived. All the while, Darius grew very, very rich, as did his sprawling empire. But he went further still. Not stopping at currency, Darius also standardized the system of weights and measures across the empire. Commodities, building materials, foodstuffs, everything now measured on the same scale according to the same standards. And to govern the ways that all the citizens of this cosmopolitan empire interacted with one another, he ensured the uniform application of his legal code, overseen by judges personally selected by their king for their commitment to the truth. A resident in Halicarnassus was held to the same standard and protected by the same rights as a resident in Shiraz. The satrapy of Egypt administered in the same way and according to the same universal laws as that of Dragonia or Gandaria or Bactria. Ahura Mazda's truth was universal. So too was Darius's legal code. Of course, there was one thing expected of every great king: conquest. Even though the Persian Empire was massive, there was plenty of opportunity to make it bigger still. Over the course of his reign, Darius organized and either personally led or ordered his armies to take up arms and conquer yet more land. Among the notable accomplishments, the armies of Darius expanded Persian dominion into India by conquering the Indus River Valley, further extending the east-west axis of the empire. He left behind explorers with orders to survey the region and report back what they found, anticipating the advent of cultural anthropology by a few thousand years. He also avenged the death of Cyrus, crushing the upstart kingdom that killed his predecessor and adding it to his dominions. Back in 513 BCE, Darius had also begun the project of expanding his kingdom westward. He crossed over from Asia into Europe and began a series of campaigns aimed at expanding Persian hegemony into a whole other continent. These projects, organized by his brilliant general Mardonius, met with more successes than not, and the Persians came to dominate the region known as Thrace, immediately to the west of the Dardanelles, or as they were called in ancient times, the Hellespont. Darius ordered several campaigns to build on this European beachhead. Macedonia, another kingdom in Eastern Europe, willingly submitted to Persian rule and became a vassal kingdom of the Persians. In the episodes that will follow this one, the Macedonians will loom very large in our story, and we will spend more time getting to know them. But just know they were willing collaborators of the Persians in Darius's project to push the boundaries of the empire further and further out. Beyond all this martial fervor and desire for conquest seems to have been a sincere and pious devotion to Ahura Mazda, and Darius's belief in the importance of bringing the truth to as many people as possible. It's worth pointing out that the quality of life in the Persian Empire under the Achaemenids pointed to the efficacy of its administration. For the average Persian, life was pretty good. The only challenge was that some stubborn people valued their own cultural values and freedoms more than those Darius wanted to force on people at the tip of a spear. Trouble loomed as the King of Kings sought to balloon the borders of his empire into Europe. Still, in its early phases, Darius's European expansion had gone swimmingly, establishing his control over the rough-and-tumble Thracians and strong but rustic Macedonians. As the late 500s became the early 400s BCE, the Persians loomed as a menace to another prominent culture due south of Thrace and Macedonia, the Greeks. In 499 BCE, the Hellenic Ionian cities, that is, cities on the western Anatolian coast with strong Greek cultural affiliation, rose up in revolt against their Persian overlords. These were the cities that had been incorporated into Persia following the war with and the defeat of Croesus, including Halicarnassus, Ephesus, Miletus, and Sardis. While ostensibly incorporated into the Persian Empire, these cities were more Greek in outlook and geographic orientation. The distance between Halicarnassus, on the southeastern coast of Anatolia, and Athens is about 300 miles. From Halicarnassus to Persepolis is over 2,000 miles. The cause of the disaffection of the agitators in these cities was the resentment over the local rule of the administrators who had been appointed by the Persian satrap, Artaphernes, who, among other things, was the younger brother of Darius. One of the local administrators underneath Artaphernes botched an important assignment to which he had been assigned. Failure of local magistrates often came with very steep penalties, including mutilation or execution. So, rather than face the consequences, he turned on his Persian overlords and fomented revolt within the Ionian cities. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Perhaps catching the Persians off guard, the rebels had initial success, including sacking the regional capital of Sardis. Given the wealth and strategic importance of this region, Darius acted quickly, ordering his generals to march down the royal road and suppress the rebellion. Given the great distances and the resources on which the locals could draw, this was no easy rebellion to suppress, but Darius was methodical, if not entirely patient. It took a few years, but eventually the Persians not only reasserted their control, but tightened their grip, coming out stronger on the other side. By 493 BCE, the revolt was over, but far from being vengeful and bloodthirsty, the Persians were even-keeled in their response. No wholesale executions or reducing cities to rubble. They just wanted their systems to run smoothly, and Darius understood that vicious reprisals would only make the Ionian cities more likely to rise up again in the future. He was remarkably even-handed, especially given the values of his day. The Ionian revolt would have been just another one of those petty rebellions so effectively quashed by Darius, if not for one key difference. The Greeks, especially those cocky Athenians, had encouraged the rebellion and offered resistance to the Ionians, less as a commitment to the principles of freedom and liberty, and more to take advantage of an opportunity to stick it to the looming menace of Persia. Dissent from within his empire was one thing. Darius drew a firm line between his attitude toward his own citizens and those of foreign agitators. Meddling by a foreigner had to be treated differently. Thus, within the context of the Ionian revolt, the feuding and warfare between the Persians and Greeks were born. Because the histories that come down to us from these times are largely written from Greek authors, in this looming conflict are the origins of the demonization of the Persians in the popular imagination, such as can be seen in the entertaining but highly ridiculous movie 300. Enraged by the Greeks, in particular the Athenian interference, Darius ordered his generals to prepare a putative expedition to put those meddlesome Hellenes in their place. Their initial attempts were hampered by bad weather and unruly Thracian tribesmen. When the Persians finally got their act together, and made their way to the Greek mainland, their fairly small expeditionary force was defeated by the Athenian-led coalition at the Battle of Marathon. It might be a little surprising that this battle, which has become so famous and ingrained in the popular imagination as an epochal triumph, gets such little treatment in this episode. But while it was certainly a watershed moment for the Greeks, the Battle of Marathon was really a footnote in both Persian history in general and Darius' history in particular. This campaign was a teeny tiny part of an epic life and career, and the contested land we're talking about is a pittance compared to the grand sweep of the mighty Persian Empire. So Greece, get over yourself. But still, the hubris of the Greeks rankled. Darius was a proud man, and he didn't care to have those Greeks smugly assuming they could stand up to his mighty empire. He began drawing up plans for a grander invasion, more troops, more ships, more cavalry, and more, well, Darius. This time, rather than trust his generals to lead the campaign, the King of Kings would personally command the operation. The plan was sophisticated. It took 3 years to develop. Unfortunately for Darius, and probably fortunately for the Greeks, the King of Kings died before he could realize his plans. In 486, Darius the Great died, leaving the kingdom and the Greek campaign to Xerxes, his son by Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great. Thus in Xerxes, the two branches of the mighty Achaemenids were merged into one. Darius was embalmed and laid to rest in a monumental rock-cut tomb he had prepared. Unlike Cyrus, whose tomb was carved with this simple and humble inscription, Darius was grandiose and boastful. I'll quote it at length. Quote, "A great God is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created yonder sky, who created man, who created happiness for man, who made Darius king, one king of many, one lord of many. I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing all kinds of men, king in this great earth far and wide, son of Hystaspes, an Achaemenid, a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan, having Aryan lineage. King Darius says, by the favor of Ahura Mazda, these are the countries which I seized outside of Persia. I ruled over them. They bore tribute to me. They did what was said to them by me. They held my law firmly. Medea, Elam, Parthia, Aria, Bactria, Sogdia, Chorasmia, Drangiana, Arcosia, Sagatia, Gandaria, India, the Hauma-drinking Scythians, the Scythians with pointed caps, Babylonia, Assyria, Arabia, Egypt, Armenia, Cappadocia, Lydia, the Greeks, the Scythians across the sea, Thrace, the sun hat-wearing Greeks, the Libyans, the Nubians, the men of Makkah, and the Carians." Close quote. We could give Darius the last word, or we could take a moment and give his life and career an assessment. Darius rose to power in highly shady circumstances. His story about fake Bardia still makes us shake our heads today. His deception in attaining the throne at the expense of his co-conspirators points to his duplicity, or at least his capacity to invent legends that show off his own cunning. But once he got into office, he showed a remarkable depth of energy and competence. He put out revolts across his empire, and once the dust settled, he never looked back. His administrative genius was to balance standardization across the empire with local autonomy and individualism. Darius protected the freedom of religion and carried forward the enlightened policies of Cyrus with regards to the rights of citizens of the empire. He entrusted local leaders with wide authority, but made sure they operated with the highest standards of justice. He was a great reformer and administrator. He didn't just approach problems piecemeal. Rather, as a man of great vision, he thought about and addressed challenges and reforms holistically and sought uniform application of the law and the Persian system across its 2 million square miles. And of course, despite his setbacks in his European adventures, he pushed the Achaemenid Empire to its largest extent. Given the conquest of his predecessors, that is saying something. In fact, he was so efficient at building and governing, he made it easier for successors to run the ship of state fairly smoothly, even when those successors were not Persian, but rather, say, Macedonian, because in a few generations, Persia won't be run by Persians. In case you missed it, that was a teaser for the next episode. The scale of the empire built and run by Darius is truly staggering. Populations in the ancient world are notoriously hard to estimate, but consensus seems to be that at its peak under Darius, the Achaemenid Persian Empire had a population of 50 million people. If that doesn't sound like much, consider this. The entire Earth's population at this time was likely somewhere between 100 million and 160 million people. Thus, Darius ruled over somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all of the people on the planet. and all with the uniquely Darian balance of respect for local values and traditions with strong centralized government. The scale of what he had to look after was and is mind-blowing. Imagine a country today with 4 billion people. And he did it with such deft intelligence, such grand vision, such administrative genius, that he sets himself apart as a great ruler. Back in the beginning of this episode, I shared that I was on the fence about whether or not I even wanted to do an episode on Darius. I have to say, I'm glad I ended up doing this episode. He's a lot more interesting than I first thought. Now that I've done it, I'll admit, I like Darius a lot more now that I've taken the time to get to know him better. And I hope you do too. Either way, though, he was a consequential figure and definitely a great worth getting to know. But what's more is that, thanks to this long look at first Cyrus, then Darius, we've gotten to know the Persian Empire better too. For me, this has been fortunate. Persia was deeply derided by the Greeks, in particular historians and chroniclers such as Herodotus and Xenophon. In many of the works of these, and in those of other writers, Persia is often portrayed as tyrannical, mystical, and autocratic. Persian rulers, generals, and administrators are made to seem effeminate, rank-and-file Persian soldiers and citizens reduced to a status akin to slavery. In these works, the Persians are portrayed as a morally bankrupt, strange, and terrible other. By looking at the world through the lens of first Cyrus and then Darius, a more complete picture emerges. One where the engine of the empire is driven in no small measure by a genuine and concerted effort to ensure justice and equality. In many ways, including with women and members of the lower levels of Persian society, the world of the Persians was much freer, where people enjoyed a much stronger expression of personal freedom than, say, the ancient Athenians. Athens gets all the credit for democracy, but the freedoms that Athenian democracy brought forward did not always extend far and wide across their society. In many ways, Persia, while certainly a top-down, hereditary monarchy, embodied freedom in a more complete and authentic way. The narrative of Persia, as told by the Greeks, and that still finds expression in popular culture today, was and is misleading. It might have taken the militaristic genius of Cyrus to win for the Achaemenids huge swathes of territory from the Hindu Kush to the Mediterranean, but it took the unsurpassed administrative genius of Darius to forge it all into an empire. Far from stealing one another's thunder, they complemented each other. Darius made Cyrus greater. Cyrus made Darius greater. One of the greatest 1-2 punches in all of history. We can put aside the Greek depictions as ethnocentric and untrustworthy. We can appreciate Cyrus, Darius, and the empire they built for what it truly was. The world's first truly great empire, not just conquered, but governed with a firm sense of justice and fairness. Not only are Cyrus and Darius rightly counted among the greats of history, but so too is the great Persian civilization. If you'd like, you can pay him a visit. Darius I commissioned a monumental tomb for himself. I read just a moment ago the inscription that was carved upon it. It's about 7.5 miles away from Persepolis. The great king ordered, not a humble building like that of Cyrus to lay atop his bones, but a massive tomb cut directly into a granite rock wall. It's huge and complete with carving of the King of Kings. Complete with reliefs, inscriptions, and records of his deed, the tomb of Darius is a fitting resting place for him, a larger-than-life memorial to a larger-than-life figure. In its sculptural program, the tomb depicts Darius paying homage to Ahura Mazda, but given its scale, the tomb was also designed to be a place of cult devotion to Darius himself. Grateful Persians would travel to the site to pay their respects to the king that took the empire to its greatest heights. Rest well, Darius. You definitely earned it. I've taken to closing with a reminder that I appreciate your help in getting the word out about this podcast series. I can't do it without you. Please share, and hopefully bring a few friends along with you the next time. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am so grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we dive into the life and time of history's all-time, top of the heap, absolutely most famous person, Alexander the Great.